There's a house on Linden Street that every kid in my hometown knows to avoid. It stands on a large corner lot, towering over the rows of neatly kept, cheery suburban homes like a blight, an old Victorian left to rot over the years. The local kids call it the Gray House. Its peeling paint, sagging roof, and warped windows give it a permanent look of distress. And no one seems to know who owns it or why it's never been torn down. Most just leave it alone. But that wasn't enough for me. When I was 12, I'd become obsessed with ghosts. Maybe it was the cheap thrill of being scared or that stubborn preteen curiosity that makes you want to prove adults wrong. But I wanted to see one, to have a story of my own. And when you're a kid with too much curiosity and too little fear, you end up making some questionable decisions. It was the beginning of fall when I finally convinced my friend Jonah to sneak into the Gray House with me. We went at dusk, bringing flashlights and a few pieces of chalk we'd swiped from his dad's toolkit, convinced we'd mark a path to follow if we got lost inside. We were nervous, but I kept up a brave face, laughing and telling Jonah how it was probably just an old house, no big deal. When we reached the door, it was already slightly ajar, as if someone had expected us. That should have been our first warning, but of course we pushed it open and went in. The smell hit me first, like something old, damp and rotting. The air was thick with dust and an unexplainable chill that made my skin crawl. The floor creaked under our weight as we stepped inside, and every sound seemed to echo through the empty rooms. My flashlight revealed faded wallpaper peeling from the walls, revealing dark patches of mold underneath. "I told you this place was haunted," Jonah whispered, his eyes wide as he looked around. Maybe I whispered back, though I didn't believe it. Not yet, anyway. We wandered through the front hall, passing a grand staircase that curved up into the shadows. A few of the steps were missing, and I could see nails and broken wood poking out. Something about that staircase felt wrong. I remember staring at it, feeling a tug of unease, but Jonah was already ahead of me, so I shook it off and followed him. We found ourselves in what must have been the living room. The furniture was still there, covered in sheets that looked almost gray under the dust. One of the windows had a crack running through it, letting in a sliver of fading light. Everything was silent. Then, in the corner of the room, I noticed something odd. A mirror. A large old mirror leaned against the wall, its frame tarnished and dark. The glass was cloudy, streaked with grime, but I could make out our reflections as we stepped closer. Jonah's face was pale, his eyes darting around, but I was looking at myself. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but the longer I stared, the more certain I became. Behind us, reflected in the mirror, was another figure. A woman, standing perfectly still, watching us. She was barely visible, her face just a smudge of white, with hollow, empty eyes that stared back through the mirror's dirt-streaked glass. Her figure seemed to flicker, almost like a bad TV signal, fading in and out with a slow, eerie rhythm. "Jonah!" He turned, following my gaze, and froze. I watched as his face drained of color. Oh no," he murmured, backing away from the mirror. The woman's head tilted, just slightly, as if she were examining us. Her mouth, just a faint line in the glass, twisted into what looked like a smile, or maybe a grimace. It was hard to tell. I wanted to move, to turn away, but I was rooted to the spot. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last, until all I could hear was the thundering in my ears. Then suddenly she was gone. The room was quiet again, and the mirror showed only our reflections, pale and shaken. "Let's go." I didn't care about proving anything anymore. I just wanted to get out of that house. But as we turned to leave, a soft, almost inaudible sound drifted through the room. It was the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere above us. They grew louder, each creak on the floorboards reverberating through the house, making the walls seem to close in around us. Jonah grabbed my arm, his hand clammy and cold. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, too afraid to speak. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a new sound, a low, raspy whisper. It was coming from just above us, barely discernible, but I could hear it. Words. She was saying words. I strained to make them out, but they seemed to shift, like a voice carried by the wind. And then, clear as day, I heard it. "Why? Did you come?" We somehow managed to sprint down the stairs, through the front hall, and out the door, my heart racing so hard it hurt. We didn't stop until we reached Jonah's house, collapsing onto his front lawn, gasping for breath, too shaken to even speak. The days after that night were strange. I couldn't get her out of my mind. The woman in the mirror, the cold, hollow look in her eyes. At night, I'd wake up, convinced I'd heard footsteps outside my window or soft whispers calling my name. A week later, I found out that the gray house had a story after all, one the older residents never liked to share. Years ago, it had belonged to a family, a man and his wife. She had spent her days by herself in that house, slowly losing her mind, convinced that someone or something was watching her from the mirrors. Eventually, she locked herself in that very room where we'd seen her, staring into that same mirror, until, well, no one was quite sure what happened to her. But they say she never left. The details were sparse, and the only person who seemed willing to talk was Mr. Grayson, a retired postal worker who had known just about everyone in town. I approached him cautiously, hoping he wouldn't just laugh at me and wave me off, as most adults did when I asked about the gray house. To my surprise, Mr. Grayson took a long, thoughtful look at me before inviting me to sit with him on his porch. He had a worn look about him, as if just thinking about the house made him tired. He leaned forward, folding his hands together and letting out a sigh that sounded as if it had been bottled up for years. "The woman you saw," he began, voice low, almost as if someone might overhear. "Her name was Agatha Pierce. She was a strange woman, I'll admit. She was born in that house and raised in it. And from what I remember, she hardly ever left it." I shifted uncomfortably, feeling a twinge of fear creeping up my spine. He noticed my reaction and shook his head. "Look, kid," he said, leaning back in his chair. "People around here don't like to remember the Pierces. There's something unnatural about that house. I can't tell you how many owners it's had since Agatha, but none of them stayed long. It's like the place holds onto something dark." When he said this, his eyes drifted toward the street, as if he could see the house from his porch, though it was blocks away. Agatha had a reputation for being, let's say, peculiar, he continued. People said she was strange even as a girl. Her parents were strict and kept her sheltered. She wasn't allowed to go to school or have friends, and as she got older, she grew more and more isolated. There were rumors she'd taken to talking to herself, staring at mirrors. Even back then, he paused, looking at me to see if I was still listening. I nodded, holding my breath, waiting for him to go on. "Well, Agatha got married eventually to a man named Thomas Pierce. But even after she was married, she barely left the house. They say she spent most of her days staring into the mirrors, just watching herself. She grew paranoid, thinking someone was watching her every move. She covered up most of the mirrors in the house, but there was one she wouldn't cover, that big one in the living room. She would sit in front of it for hours, whispering to herself." He sighed, rubbing his temples, as if the memory of Agatha still weighed heavily on him. Thomas tried to bring in doctors, priests, anyone who might help her, but she wouldn't see them, said they didn't understand, that they weren't real. What happened to her? Mr. Grayson didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted, unfocused, as if he were looking at something far away. "No one really knows," he finally replied. One day, Thomas went into town, and when he came back, Agatha had locked herself in the living room. He knocked on the door, begged her to open it, but she didn't respond. He broke it down eventually, but when he got inside, she was gone. Gone, I repeated, feeling my throat go dry. "What do you mean? Did she leave?" He shook his head slowly. "No, everything was in its place. There was no sign of a struggle, no open doors, no footprints. She was just gone. The only thing that seemed strange was the mirror. They said it was cracked, a thin, jagged line running from the top right corner down to the bottom left. But no one knows how. There was no sign of violence. Agatha had simply vanished. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. A cracked mirror like the one I'd seen in the house. The one that still stood in that abandoned living room, covered in dust, where I'd seen the faint image of her face. Mr. Grayson's voice was barely above a whisper now. People in town started saying the house was cursed. Thomas sold it and left not long after. Some said she never really left the mirror, that she'd found a way to slip inside it, to hide in its reflection. A chill ran through me, my mind racing. I wanted to believe it was just an old story, a tale spun to scare kids, but I couldn't shake the memory of what I'd seen. The figure in the mirror, her face blurred but unmistakable, her eyes hollow and watching. And that feeling, the feeling that she was aware of us, that she had noticed us. After my conversation with Mr. Grayson, I avoided Linden Street entirely. I tried to push the memory of the house, the mirror, and Agatha's ghostly figure from my mind. But as hard as I tried, there was a pull, an urge I couldn't quite explain. It was as if something was tugging at the edge of my thoughts, whispering to me, drawing me back to that place. A few weeks later, Jonah came to my house, his face pale, his eyes wide. "She's back," he whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't have to ask who he meant. He didn't need to explain further. He'd been feeling it too. We told ourselves we'd just pass by, maybe look at the house from a distance. But as soon as we turned onto Linden Street, I felt it. A deep, cold dread sinking into my bones. The gray house loomed at the corner, its sagging frame somehow darker, more twisted. It was like the house had aged 100 years in the short time since I'd last seen it. Without speaking, we walked up to the front steps. The door was closed this time, but when I reached for it, it swung open as if inviting us in. Jonah and I exchanged a look, both of us too scared to move, but neither willing to back down. Slowly, we stepped inside, the familiar smell of mold and decay hitting us once more. The air was heavy, oppressive. Every step we took seemed to echo through the empty house, louder than I remembered. We made our way back to the living room, the room where we'd seen her. And there it was, the mirror standing in the corner, cracked in the same place, dust coating its surface like a veil. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to touch it. My hand reached out, fingers brushing against the cold, grimy glass. For a moment, I thought I saw my own face staring back at me. Then the glass flickered. I yanked my hand back as the reflection warped, like a ripple spreading through water. Slowly, her figure began to emerge in the glass, the shape of her face coming into view, those hollow eyes fixing on me with a look of eerie calm. "Why did you come back?" she asked, her voice soft but sharp, cutting through the silence like a knife. Jonah whimpered, but he didn't move. I wanted to look away, to run, but I was frozen, trapped in her gaze. "Please." Her mouth curved into a faint, ghostly smile, and for a split second, I felt something. A pull, like a gentle tug at the edges of my mind. The room around me began to feel hazy, distant, like a fading dream. But then, Just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The figure in the mirror faded, leaving only my own terrified face staring back at me. I stumbled backward, feeling the cold weight of dread settle in my chest. Then I saw it. At first, it seemed like a smudge on the glass, a faint shadow behind my shoulder, but as I looked closer, I could see it more clearly. A hand. The outline of a hand, just behind me, close enough that it should have been touching me, yet I felt nothing. My breath hitched as I realized the hand wasn't mine. I spun around, but of course no one was there. Just the dim, empty room and Jonah, standing frozen by the door, his face drained of color. Did you see it? I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. Jonah nodded, wide-eyed, his mouth moving silently, as though he was trying to find words that wouldn't come. He took a shaky step backward, toward the hallway, his eyes darting from me to the mirror and back again. "We need to get out of here. Now," he finally whispered, his voice thick with fear. But as we turned to leave, the room seemed to shift. The air grew dense, and a low, almost imperceptible hum filled my ears, like the distant sound of buzzing. I tried to shake it off, but the sound only grew louder, settling into a strange, rhythmic pattern, like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. Each beat seemed to pulse through my body, dragging me down, rooting me to the spot. "Wait," I said, the word tumbling out before I even knew what I was doing. "Something's wrong." My hand moved on its own, reaching back toward the mirror. Jonah grabbed my arm, pulling me sharply. "Don't," he whispered, his face twisted with terror. "She wants you to." I tried to move, to tear my gaze from the mirror, but my reflection held me captive. I watched myself, my own face filled with horror and confusion. And there, in the depths of my own eyes, I saw her. She was there, faint and almost hidden, but as I stared, her figure became clearer. Her face was barely distinguishable, blurred around the edges, as if she were emerging from some dark, faraway place. Her expression was calm, almost serene, and yet her eyes held a chilling intent. Slowly, her mouth began to move, forming words that I could see but not hear. Her lips curled into a slight, twisted smile as she mouthed, "I can see you." It felt like her voice was in my head, soft and insidious, like a whisper crawling up my spine. I looked away, struggling to breathe, feeling that heavy sense of dread sink deeper into my bones. But even as I turned from the mirror, her presence lingered, like a faint shadow just at the edge of my vision. The buzzing in my ears faded as we stumbled into the hallway, our footsteps echoing through the empty house. The oppressive air lifted, but the feeling of being watched lingered, prickling at the back of my neck. We were halfway down the hallway when we heard it. A soft, creaking sound, like someone taking a step on old wood. Both of us stopped, and I felt my pulse quicken as the sound continued, coming from somewhere behind us, slow and deliberate. Footsteps. They moved in a rhythm, echoing through the house, growing closer, each step louder than the last. Jonah's face went pale, his eyes wide with panic. "Run," he whispered, and before he took off down the hallway, I followed, my legs shaky but desperate to put as much distance between us and whatever was behind us. The sound of footsteps didn't stop. They grew faster, matching our pace, closing in on us as we ran down the narrow hallway and into the foyer. When we reached the front door, I grabbed the doorknob, twisting it frantically, but it wouldn't budge. My heart pounded as I yanked on the handle, desperation clawing at my throat. Jonah pushed at the door with me, but it was as if some invisible force was holding it shut. Then I felt it, a cold breath on the back of my neck. Slowly, I turned my head, barely daring to look. In the dim light, I saw her, the woman from the mirror, standing just a few feet away, her face half hidden in shadow. Her eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to pull at me, and her lips were stretched into a thin, cruel smile. She took a step closer, her movements slow, deliberate, like she had all the time in the world. Her eyes never left mine, and in that moment, I felt something strange, like she was studying me, sizing me up, as though she were deciding what to do with me. Jonah whispered my name, pulling me back to reality. With one final, desperate shove, we pushed the door open, stumbling out onto the porch. The cold night air hit me like a wave, and I sucked in a breath, feeling the weight lift from my chest. But even as we ran down the steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching us. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see her standing in the doorway, but the house was empty, dark, silent. We didn't stop running until we were several blocks away, panting and shaking, too terrified to speak. The street was quiet, the familiar neighborhood houses standing peacefully in the glow of streetlights, as if nothing strange had happened at all. But I knew, deep down, that I'd seen her, that she was real, and that she hadn't been bound to the house as I'd once thought. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the image of her hollow, watching eyes seared into my mind. Every creak of the floor, every faint whisper of wind outside my window made my heart race. I could almost feel her presence, lingering in the shadows of my room, as though she'd followed us, slipping through the cracks in the night. Over the next few days, strange things began happening around me. I'd catch glimpses of movement in mirrors out of the corner of my eye, a pale figure standing just behind me, vanishing the moment I looked directly. My reflection seemed wrong, somehow, as if it were watching me with a look of faint amusement, an expression that I knew wasn't my own. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, I looked up into the bathroom mirror and froze. There, in the reflection, was my room behind me, not the bathroom. I turned, staring in disbelief at the bathroom walls. But when I looked back at the mirror, I saw my room, dark, empty, with my bed neatly made, just as I'd left it. And there, standing at the foot of my bed, was her. She looked straight at me through the mirror, her eyes dark and endless, and her mouth curved into a slow, knowing smile. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the sink, my heart racing. When I looked again, it was just my reflection staring back, the bathroom walls where they should be. But the sense of wrongness didn't fade. The reflection felt off, twisted, as though something was waiting, lurking just beneath the surface. Over time, the strange occurrences became part of my life. Mirrors were no longer safe. They held something behind them, something dark and watching. I avoided looking directly into them whenever I could, but every once in a while, I'd feel that pull, that strange urge to look closer. And each time, I'd catch a glimpse of her, waiting in the background, her hollow eyes fixed on me, her smile filled with a silent, sinister promise.